The blizzard roared outside, its icy winds battering the walls of Jack's cabin. Inside, the retired firefighter sat in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the room. He had been isolated for several days, and the only sound besides the storm was the occasional crackling of burning wood. Then, a noise broke the silence. A faint, desperate scratching. Jack frowned, placed his coffee mug on the table, and listened carefully. There it was again, now, followed by a muffled whimper. His heart pounded. The sound was coming from the front door. Walking cautiously to the entrance, Jack's eyes widened as he approached the glass door. Outside, in the swirling snow, stood a German shepherd, her body trembling from the cold. Nestled beneath her, barely visible, were two tiny puppies. Ice clung to her fur, and her breath came out in small white clouds. Her eyes, filled with desperation, locked onto Jack's. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Opening, that door could bring trouble. But as he met those pleading eyes, something inside him stirred. The decision he was about to make would change their lives forever. Jack's heart pounded. The storm howled behind the shivering dog, her breath fogging up the frozen glass. Her body was arched over the puppies, shielding them from the cold. They were almost disappearing under the snow piling up around them. Jack noticed her ribs showing through her ice-covered fur. Her eyes, a mix of fear and hope, never left his. "What the hell happened to you?" Jack murmured, his breath merging with the cold air. Instinctively, he gripped the doorknob. The moment the door creaked open, a blast of icy wind rushed into the cabin. The German shepherd didn't move. Her paws remained planted in the snow, her gaze still locked on Jack, as if she wasn't sure she could trust him. "Come on, girl. Get inside," Jack called, crouching to make himself seem less intimidating. "You're going to freeze out there." The dog let out a low whine, glanced quickly at her puppies, and took a hesitant step forward. Her movements were slow and cautious. Then, she nudged one of the puppies with her nose, encouraging it to follow. The smallest one stumbled in the snow, its tiny legs barely managing to hold it up. Without hesitation, the mother gently picked it up by the scruff of its neck and carried it inside, followed closely by the second pup. As soon as they were all in, Jack shut the door behind them, blocking out the relentless roar of the storm. The sudden warmth of the cabin made the German shepherd tremble even more as her body adjusted to the change in temperature. Jack grabbed an old blanket from the couch and gently placed it over her and the puppies. At first, she flinched, but as she realized he meant no harm, she let out a long, shaky sigh and lay down near the fire, curling protectively around her pups. Jack knelt beside her, his mind racing. The puppies were tiny, their eyes barely open, so fragile that he could see their small chests rising and falling with each rapid breath. He reached out to touch one, but a low growl from the mother stopped him. It wasn't aggressive, just a warning. A reminder that she still didn't trust him. All right, Jack murmured, raising his hands in surrender. "I get it. You're a good mother. You've been through hell, haven't you?" He stood up and grabbed a bowl from the kitchen, filling it with warm water and placing it near the dog. Then he stepped back, giving her space. She watched him cautiously, but after a few seconds, she leaned down and started drinking, while the puppies snuggled even closer to her. Jack observed from a distance, his thoughts restless. Where had she come from? How had she ended up in the middle of a blizzard with two newborns? Her condition suggested she had been alone for some time, long enough to become weak and desperate, but not enough to give up. The fact that she had made it here, carrying her puppies through the storm, was nothing short of a miracle. But now what? Jack wasn't prepared for this. He had always liked dogs, but after retiring, his life had become quieter. He hadn't had a pet in years, and the thought of taking care of 3 dogs, especially in such a fragile state, felt overwhelming. Still, as he looked at the exhausted mother, watching the way she curled protectively around her puppies, Jack knew he couldn't turn them away. "You've got a fighter's spirit, I'll give you that," he said softly. "I guess that makes 2 of us." As the night went on, Jack did his best to make them comfortable. He laid down towels for the puppies, placed a bowl of food near the mother, and fed the fireplace to keep the room warm. The German Shepherd watched him closely, her eyes following every movement he made. But as the hours passed, her body began to relax. For the first time, she allowed her head to rest on the blanket, her eyes blinking heavily until, finally, they closed. Jack sat in his chair, the fire crackling softly beside him. A strange sense of purpose took over him. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for now, he had done what he could. And as the storm roared outside, he made a silent promise to the mother and her puppies. Now, they were safe, and he wouldn't let anything happen to them. The next morning, Jack woke to the soft sound of whimpers and the fire, which had burned almost all the wood during the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of snow that shimmered under the morning sun. He rubbed his eyes, his mind immediately returning to the unexpected visitors who had sought refuge in his home. Turning to the fireplace, he saw the German Shepherd still curled up around the puppies. They were moving slightly, their tiny bodies squirming beneath their mother's protective embrace. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Jack's movements, and her amber eyes opened, locking onto his. There was still a cautious look on her face, but not the same desperation as the night before. "Good morning, girl," Jack said softly as he stretched and walked into the kitchen. "Let's see if we can find something for you to eat." He rummaged through the pantry and grabbed a can of chicken soup. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Jack heated it on the stove and carefully placed a bowl near her. The dog lifted her head, sniffing the air cautiously. After a few moments, she started eating. The puppies, sensing their mother's movement, let out little whimpers and tried to snuggle closer to her warmth. Jack kneeled just a few feet away, watching her as she ate. "You're strong," he said softly. "Carrying these little ones through that storm, you deserve better than this." As the morning went on, Jack took a better look at their condition. The mother was visibly underfed, her ribs showing against her thin body. The puppies, though fragile, seemed to have enough energy to try to nurse, their tiny tails wagging slightly as they clung to their mother. Jack's heart tightened as he saw their silent struggle. He had witnessed many hardships in his years as a firefighter, but there was something particularly painful about the quiet battle of these animals. Deciding to help further, Jack picked up the phone and called the nearest veterinary clinic. "Hello? This is Jack Carter," he said when the receptionist answered. "I have a German Shepherd and 2 puppies here. They're in bad shape. Do you think you could take a look at them?" The receptionist's voice was warm but firm. "Of course, Mr. Carter. We can fit them in this afternoon. Bring them in, and we'll do what we can." Jack hung up, relieved. He looked at the German Shepherd, who was now gently licking her puppies, her maternal instinct shining through despite her extreme exhaustion. Did you hear that, girl? We're going to get you some help." Taking them to the vet wasn't an easy task. Jack found an old blanket and tried gently to get the dog to lie on it. She hesitated, her body tense, and let out a low growl when he got too close to the puppies. "It's okay," he reassured her, moving slowly. "I won't hurt them, I promise." After several minutes of patience and soft words, she finally allowed Jack to lift her, along with the puppies, and place them in the back of his truck. He settled them carefully, making sure they were comfortable before driving toward town. 13. Roads were still slippery from the storm, and Jack drove cautiously, his mind spinning with questions. Where had she come from? Was someone looking for her? Or had she been abandoned, left to survive alone in the brutal cold? At the veterinary clinic, the staff moved quickly, examining the mother and puppies with experienced hands. "She's severely malnourished," said the vet, Dr. Monroe, running her hands over the dog's thin body. "But she's resilient. The puppies are lucky she made it this far." Dr. Monroe gave Jack a thoughtful look. "She's been through a lot. It's going to take time for her to fully recover, but with the right care, she'll be fine. Do you know where she came from?" Jack shook his head. "She showed up at my door last night. I couldn't leave her out there." The vet smiled softly. "Well, she picked the right door." When Jack brought them back home, the mother seemed calmer. The puppies, now fed at the clinic, wiggled happily as they snuggled close to her again. Jack sat nearby, watching as the German Shepherd finally began to relax. This time, she allowed him to get closer, her eyes softening as he reached out to gently pet her head. "You're safe now," Jack murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't know what you've been through, but you have a home here for as long as you need." For the first time, the dog leaned into his touch, her body no longer so rigid with fear. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He had opened the door to her on instinct, not knowing what would come of it. But now, seeing her trust begin to grow, he realized they had both found something they had been missing, a purpose, and perhaps a second chance. In the days that followed, a new rhythm of recovery began to take shape. The German Shepherd, whom Jack had started calling Grace, was regaining her strength. Her eyes, once dull, now sparkled with a glimmer of life, and the puppies, whom he had named Snow and Ash, grew more active each day. Jack spent hours sitting on the floor by the fireplace, allowing Grace to get used to his presence. At first, she watched him with cautious eyes, her body tense and protective. But slowly, the barriers she had built began to crumble. She started allowing him to sit closer, her growls diminishing until they were only occasional sighs. And, over time, she even let him pet her without pulling away. One night, as the wind howled outside, Jack sat on the floor, leaning against the couch, watching the fire dance in the hearth. Grace lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, while Snow and Ash clumsily tumbled over each other, their tiny tails wagging excitedly. Jack couldn't help but smile at their antics. "You've got strong puppies, Grace," he murmured, casting her a glance. She lifted her head and looked at him. In her eyes, there was something Jack could only describe as gratitude. He slowly extended his hand, brushing his fingers over her head. To his surprise, she didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned into his touch, finally relaxing. As days turned into weeks, Grace's transformation was undeniable. Her once tangled and thin coat began to shine with health. Her ribs were no longer so visible, and her energy came in bursts. She played with the puppies, nudging them with her nose and watching them stumble around the cabin with excited yips. Jack also noticed changes in himself. For years, he had lived alone in the cabin, content with the quiet of his retirement. But Grace and her puppies brought a new kind of life to his world. The quiet nights were now filled with playful barks and the soft sound of paws on the wooden floor. He hadn't realized how much he missed having a purpose. Until now. One afternoon, while chopping wood outside, Jack noticed Grace standing by the window, her nose pressed against the glass. Snow and ash played at her feet, tumbling over each other. Jack paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and waved at her. To his surprise, Grace wagged her tail, just once, but it was enough to warm his heart. When he came back inside, Grace greeted him at the door, her tail wagging slightly as she nudged his hand with her nose. It was the first time she had approached him on her own, and Jack couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. "Well, you're full of surprises today," he joked, kneeling down to scratch behind her ears. Grace leaned into his hand, her tail now wagging with more enthusiasm. Snow and Ash barked happily, circling Jack's legs in pure excitement. As the bond between them grew, Jack began to wonder about Grace's past. Where had she come from? What had brought her to his door that snowy night? The questions lingered in his mind, but one thing he was certain of. Whatever her story was, it was a story of survival and resilience. Grace had faced the worst of scenarios and still had survived, with her puppies by her side. She was a fighter, without a doubt. That night, as they all settled near the fire, Jack looked at Grace and spoke softly. "I don't know where you came from, girl, but I'm glad you found me. You and these little ones. You're part of the family now." Grace lifted her head and met his gaze. There was something in her eyes, a silent understanding, a bond that needed no words. She let out a soft sigh and rested her head on Jack's lap, her body completely at ease for the first time since she had arrived. Jack felt a lump form in his throat as he stroked her fur. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the arrival of a dog and her puppies to change his life so deeply. But there, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the soft sounds of Grace and her puppies, he realized that they had given him something he hadn't even known he was missing: companionship, purpose, and a renewed sense of hope. The morning. Light filtered through the cabin windows, casting golden rays across the floor where Snow and Ash played, tumbling over each other. Grace rested nearby, her eyes half closed, but her ears perked at every small sound. Jack, standing by the kitchen counter, took a sip of his coffee and watched them, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. But despite the tranquility of the moment, one question lingered in his mind. Where had Grace come from? She carried the signs of a hard life, the thin body, the subtle scars scattered across her coat, the cautious way she reacted to sudden movements. Someone had failed her. And Jack couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was might still be nearby. That afternoon, he decided to take Grace and the puppies outside. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing frozen patches of ground. Grace stepped cautiously onto the porch, sniffing the air as if testing the environment for dangers. The puppies, still clumsy on their paws, followed closely behind, barking excitedly as they explored the new world beyond the cabin. Jack smiled watching them. "You're safe now, girl," he murmured, Nothing's gonna hurt you here." But as they ventured a little further from the cabin, Grace suddenly stopped. Her ears pricked up, her body tense, her nose pointing toward the forest. Jack followed her gaze, feeling his own posture stiffen. "What is it?" he asked, moving closer to her. Grace let out a low growl, her fur standing on end. Jack squinted, trying to see through the trees. But he saw nothing. Still, Grace's stance said it all. Something was there. Quickly, Jack scooped the puppies into his arms and began to back away, guiding Grace back inside. Once inside the cabin, he locked the door and closed the curtains, his heart racing in his chest. Grace continued to pace restlessly near the window, her eyes fixed on the forest. Later that night, Jack sat by the fire, but he couldn't shake the sense of unease. Grace was lying with the puppies nestled against her body, but her eyes remained alert, moving toward the door at every strange noise. Jack extended his hand and gently scratched behind her ears. "You're not just imagining things, are you?" he murmured. "You've seen something like this before." His thoughts wandered as he stared at the flames. He couldn't imagine what Grace had gone through to become so distrustful. Had she been abandoned? Hurt? Jack clenched his fists at the thought. Whoever had done this to her didn't deserve to be called human. The next day, Jack decided to search for answers. He loaded Grace and the puppies into his truck and drove into town. The local animal shelter was small, but well kept, run by volunteers who knew most of the animals in the area. Jack arrived at the small animal shelter, holding a photo of Grace and her puppies. The receptionist, a kind woman named Sarah, looked at the picture before shaking her head. "I don't recognize her," she said. "But dogs like her show up more often than we'd like. A lot of breeders around here keep them in terrible conditions, and when they're no longer useful, they just abandon them." Jack felt his anger swell inside him. "You're saying she was discarded?" Sarah nodded sadly. "It happens more than you think. But she was lucky to find you." The drive back to the cabin was silent. Jack couldn't stop thinking about what he had heard. Grace had been treated like a disposable object, but not anymore. Now she was important. To her puppies, to him. And he would make sure she never felt unwanted again. When they arrived, Grace jumped out of the truck and sniffed the air, the puppies trailing behind her. Jack watched, his heart torn between anger and hope. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "No one's going to hurt you again." Grace looked at him, her amber eyes softening. For the first time, Jack had the feeling that she truly understood. And, in that moment, he made a silent promise. Whoever had done this to her would never get another chance. The following days brought a quiet calm. Grace relaxed more each day, her trust in Jack growing. Snow and Ash explored the cabin with enthusiasm, filling the space with life. But even with the tranquility, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, as he petted Grace by the fire, something caught his attention. Outside, at the edge of the forest, a figure stood. His heart raced. "Grace," Jack whispered. The dog lifted her head, followed his gaze, and immediately growled, her body tense. Jack closed the curtain and grabbed the phone. "This is Jack Carter. There's someone outside my cabin," the dispatcher promised. To send an officer. But Jack knew something was wrong. This wasn't just some stranger. It was personal. When the squad car finally arrived, Jack explained everything to Officer Miller. a serious and experienced woman. It wasn't someone lost, he said. This person was watching us. Miller examined the area and found footprints and a piece of rope tied to a tree. Looks like someone's been camping here, she said. We'll do frequent patrols. If you notice anything, let us know. After the officer left, the cabin felt heavier. Jack locked all the doors and windows. Who was out there? And why were they so interested in Grace? The next morning, Grace ran to the door, growling. Jack grabbed the rifle and peered through the curtain. The stranger was back, even closer this time. Jack stepped out onto the porch, rifle steady in his hands. Who's out there? The figure stepped forward, revealing a man in his 40s, his face hidden beneath the hood of a worn jacket. In his hand, a rope. That's my dog, he said with a threatening smile. I was looking for her. Jack's blood ran cold. Your dog? She showed up nearly dead on my doorstep with 2 puppies. If she was yours, why was she like that? The man shrugged. She ran away. It happens. But I came to take her back. Jack raised the rifle, the sight fixed on the man's chest. You're not taking her anywhere. The man's smile faltered. You have no idea what you're doing. That dog is a problem. Grace appeared in the doorway, teeth bared, a deep growl echoing in the cold air. The man took a step back. You made a mistake, old man, he said, hesitating. You're going to regret this. Jack took a step forward. The only mistake was thinking you could come back. Here and take her. Now get out before I make you regret it for real. The man hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Jack watched until there was no trace of him, then relaxed his shoulders. Back inside the cabin, he locked the door and knelt beside Grace. He's gone, he said, stroking her head. You were amazing, girl. Grace let out a trembling sigh and nestled against him. Snow and ash, oblivious to the danger, slept near the fire. Jack picked them up and placed them next to their mother, who protected them instinctively. That night, Jack stayed awake, watching through the window. He knew the man might return, but he also knew that Grace wouldn't run this time. She had found her home, her family, and Jack had too. Together they had faced a dark past and found something stronger than fear: hope. If this story touched your heart, be inspired to make a difference. Adopt, support a shelter, or share this message. Thank you for being part of this journey.